Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This session is Animal Farm, where we'll be exploring the role of animals in past society. We'll be exploring how humans have used animals, how archaeologists can study that use, and what this can tell us about the relationship between animals and humans, and why that matters. So first of all, just a quick quiz. Just a few questions, write down the answers in your workbook. We'll go through them one by one. Give yourselves a point for every correct answer. So first of all, which animal's bones were used to build this prehistoric house? Okay, so the answer to that question is mammoths. You can see there's a skeleton, perhaps the jaws around the bones around the jaw have been used to create the foundations for the house, and the long bones have created the superstructure. So the relationship between humans and animals goes back a long way. Next question, what was the first animal in the world to be domesticated by humans, to actually live with humans, be looked after by humans? Okay, so the answer to that question is the dog. And in fact, here's a list of some major animals that have been domesticated by humans with their dates. The dog, then sheep, cat, goat, pig, cow, chicken, guinea pig, donkey, horse, silkworm, llama, Bactrian camel, dromedary camel, honeybee, water buffalo, duck, yak, alpaca, reindeer, and then turkey. And there are others, of course, but you can see the range of animals and the amount of time over which humans have been building that close relationship with animals, where humans look after animals so they can make use of them. So what is that use then? How many secondary products of animals, that's things that you can use from animals without killing them, can you think of? Write down as many as you can think of. Okay, so in answer to the question about secondary products, the use we can make of animals without having to kill them for their meat, milk, of course, wool, fur, blood, antler, feces, urine, traction, pulling things, transport to move things around, pest control, and of course more animals. Once you've got a captive herd of animals, you can breed more animals. Which animal is believed to have passed on fleas with Black Death plague bacteria, causing a pandemic which killed half the population of the world in the 14th century? Okay, the answer to that question is black rats. Though actually plague can be transmitted by a whole load of other sorts of rodent-like animals like squirrels, marmots, lemurs, prairie dogs, and that still happens today. Next question, what secondary product did a medieval bateman sell? Well, the answer to that question, we went through all those secondary products. I wonder if you've got the right one, because actually it's dog feces, dog poo. Some people actually earned a living going around collecting up dog poo. Not for the reason we do now, just to keep the streets tidy, but because it was a material that was used in the tanning industry to help preserve leather. It's been a smelly job. Next question, which animals farmed for their meat for thousands of years in South America became popular as pets in Europe from the 16th century? So the answer to that question is guinea pigs. And if you have a pet guinea pig and want to look away now, I'm going to show you a picture of what that guinea pig looks like when it is cooked for dinner. Doesn't look particularly appetizing, really. So what did you score? You can see from that, though, the range of uses to which animals are put. And that history goes back a long time. So it's very important that as archaeologists we can recognise that, because otherwise we won't understand the way human society works or appreciate the value of other species than humans. And it's also important because animal bone is one of the most commonly found things in many archaeological excavations. So given that we are often thinking about bones as archaeologists, have a look at this skeleton and draw what you think it looked like when it was alive. Now I'll give you as much time as you want to do that. Have a look at everything you can see about that animal. Shape of its teeth, its tail, its feet, its position. They're all clues, and this is an animal you will have heard of. So take as long as you want to draw a reconstruction drawing of what you think that animal looked like. So now you've had a bit of time to draw what that animal looked like, and maybe you've talked it over with others in your class, and maybe you've agreed, or maybe you've had different ideas. I wonder if anyone got it right. Because here's the skeleton, and this is what that animal actually is. It's a hedgehog. It seems really difficult to believe when you look at a hedgehog, and that example from Museum in Cambridge you can see there, and you look at the skeleton, because they look such different shapes. You can see the sort of two together. You can start to see a little bit about how that works. But what's really important to remember when, as archaeologists, we're looking at bones, is how easy it is to get confused because they don't look the same. The skeleton is just the minimal amount that's remaining of an animal that was very different when it was alive. But it's usually the only clue we have. And the fact that skeletons look different is, of course, recognised in these books. You may have seen these as children, the Funny Bones books, and the animal and human skeletons in those are the same shape as they are in real life. And that's just not what skeletons actually look like. The elephant's trunk, for example, is just soft tissue like your nose. There is no sign of the elephant's trunk on its skeleton at all. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is have a look at some skeletons and try and work out what animals they are. Now, they're all animals that are commonly or fairly commonly found on archaeological excavations, and I will tell you that none of them's a hedgehog. So you've got pictures in your workbook of some outline animal skeletons. Try and match the 3D models of skeletons with those outlines. See if you can get those right. So here's the first one. So what animal did you think that was? You probably noticed there's a couple of words down in the bottom left-hand corner there. That is the Latin name of that animal. That might or might not give you a little bit of a clue. So here's the animal. This is actually a cow skeleton, skeleton of a cattle. And you can, I think, see the similarity. And of course, Taurus, Bos Taurus, Taurus is the sign of the zodiac for the bull and male cow. So here's the next one. Have a little look at that and see if you can work out what that is. Okay, did you get that right? Which of your animals on your worksheet did you write the letter B against, with the sus scroffa domesticus? Does that help you work that out? Yep, it's a pig. Again, quite a different sort of shape, perhaps, to when we see it alive. So next one then, Canis Familiaris. Is it familiar to you? It's a little bit of a difficult one, this perhaps in some ways, because this particular species comes in lots of different shapes and sizes. But what it actually is, and again, when you see it with the skeleton and the outline of the animal as it would have been in life around it, it's a dog, a domesticated dog. So here's the next one. What do you think that might be? So you've had a chance to work out or guess which of your skeleton outlines put the letter D against for Ovis Aries. It's a sheep. Aries the ram, again, another sign of the zodiac, if you know those, just as a little clue, the same Latin word coming in there. And again, sheep look very different in life because they're big and woolly. It's a bit like the hedgehog problem, really. They look much bigger and fatter in life than they do from a skeleton. So here's the next one, Felis catus. Okay, so you've had a bit of a chance to think about which of the outlines on your book match up with this one. And this, again, once you get the outline on, perhaps you can see it a bit more clearly. It's a domestic cat. Here's the next one, Equus caballus. Okay, you've had a chance to have a think about Equus caballus, and it is, make it a bit more obvious, it's a horse. Again, slightly different shape. And now I wonder if you'll get this one. Here's the Cervus elaphus. Okay, so you've had a chance to think about that. Which one did you go for? I expect you might have got this right because the antlers are a bit of a giveaway on this one. You're probably pretty confident it was a deer of some sort. It's actually a red deer. Very high status animals in the most pre-modern periods. Venison is an expensive meat today, and in pre-modern periods, deer were only really available to people who sort of had the land and the time to be able to go hunting. So unlike the sort of sheep and the cow and the pig and the dog and the cat, the sort of much more ordinary domesticated species, deer are pretty much more uncommon. If you found those on an archaeological site, you've got somewhere quite special. So here's the next one. Another different sort of animal here. I wonder if you'll get this. Okay, you've had a chance to have a look at this. I wonder if you managed to get this right. Another animal I think probably does look quite different, easy to get distracted by its external appearance. But actually when you put the ears and the little fluffy tail on it, it is of course a rabbit. Another quite high status meat in most pre-modern periods. They're not indigenous to the British Isles, the rabbit. They come from the Mediterranean. Introduced by the Romans and then died out after that and then reintroduced by the Normans. They were very much elite meat in the medieval period. The only people who would have access to rabbit would be lords who had enough land to be able to purpose-build little rabbit warrens for them to live in. So quite delicate creatures and needed to be looked after. So if you find rabbit bone on a site before about 1700, again you've got somewhere quite special. Rabbits are a bit of a pain for archaeologists because, of course, they tend to burrow into the ground, so sometimes we find them in earlier layers than they were actually living in. And here's Gallus gallus. What do you think this one is? Okay, you've had a chance to think about what this is. I suspect you might have got this right. It is, of course, the chicken. Again, very familiar, domesticated bird, used extensively for food, particularly now. So that's the end of part one. Part two, we'll look at some archaeological examples and a couple of case studies for you to puzzle out. See you in a minute. So, part two of Animal Farm, and we'll pick up having started to look at skeletons and the shape of the bones and the sort of thinking a little bit about the size that animals are as well. What we're going to do now is give you some faunal assemblages, that's collections of animal bones, or examples of animal bones from collections to look at. Because of course, on archaeological sites, we don't usually find whole articulated skeletons like the ones you were looking at in part one of Animal Farm. What we tend to find is just bits of bones. So your challenge for the next few slides is to have a careful look at each bone and include its size as well as a centimetre scale on each slide so you can get some sort of idea of how big the bone is. Compare it to the outline skeletons in your workbook and write down what animal you think it might have been from. And if you can, write down what bone you think it was. And you might be able to start that by eliminating which animals do you definitely think it's not. Which animals are size completely wrong for? Which bones do you definitely think it isn't? If you don't think it looks like a vertebra, one of the bones of the spine, you can probably rule out something like that because they're quite unusual looking. You've got those pictures in your workbook to refer to, and of course your memory of having looked at them just now. So get 1 point if you get the animal right, and another one if you get the bone right. And if you think you've managed to spot that that particular bone had been eaten and you're right, then give yourselves another point. So here's the first bone then, and you can see that centimetre scale going from 1 centimetre to 20 along the bottom, so you've got an idea of how big those two bones are. They're obviously two different bones, they are from the same species. Have a look at them and see if you can think what part of the body they might have come from and what animal it might have been. And I'll give you a few minutes and then I'll show you which actual animal it's from, and that might help you work out whereabouts the animal on the body it had come from if you haven't done that. I'll give you a couple of minutes to just look at the bones first. Okay, so you've had a couple of minutes to look at the bones. Now I'm going to show you what animal it's from. So these two bones are from a sheep. So we saw that before, and of course sheep are useful for all sorts of things other than bones for meat. They're farmed extensively for wool, of course. You can actually use them for milk. You can use them for getting more sheep, of course. So have a look at the bones. See if you can think now now you've got the skeleton there next to the bone. Have a think about where on the body you think that came from. I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so you've had a chance to have a think. So in fact, this is a femur and a tibia from a sheep. So it's the sort of upper and lower leg bone. Animals are rather different to us. The femur, the thigh bone, is kind of much more inside the animal really than it is with us. And what we think of as the upper leg bone is actually our lower leg bone. And what looks like the lower leg bone on most animals are the bones, actually the long bones in our feet. So the skeletons are the same. And humans and mammals certainly, and even humans and birds, have the same sorts of bones, but they're in different shapes depending on the way that evolution has selected particular characteristics to enable that animal to survive in the way that it's adapting to. So here we can see the sheep femur and tibia. They're both interestingly unfused. So when you're growing, the ends of your bones are separate because your bones grow at the end. And it's not until you've finished growing that the end of the bone actually fuses onto the long bit in the middle of the bone. And what we can see here is particularly marked in the lower of those two bones on the tibia there. At the right-hand end, you can see it hasn't got a sort of rounded end that one would expect from that bone. It's got a sort of spongy, it looks like it's been broken off. But that's where the end of the bone, the rounded end of the bone, hasn't been fused to it. So since the animal's been dead and the soft tissue that would have kept the two bones together has decayed, that end, it's called an epiphysis, that end has become separate. So all we've got is that bone. Now that's important because that tells us that that animal died quite young, under a year old. That may have been because it was sick, but it's more likely to simply be that it was probably a male, it wasn't needed to be kept for breeding purposes, maybe it wasn't a wool-bearing breed of sheep, so it perhaps was slaughtered young, because obviously you don't need very many males to breed new sheep. Your females are good for that, but you only need a couple of prize rams, and the rest of the males are not as valuable unless they're producing good wool. Of course, young meat is tender and it's tasty, so it would have been quite a luxury. So it may suggest that somebody quite wealthy has been living in the place this bone came from, because they can afford to have nice, tender, juicy meat. That's just to show you that end I was talking about. So here's the next one then. Now this might look pretty difficult, but remember you're thinking about what bone is it, look at the size, think about where on the body it might come from, where it couldn't come from, which bones is it definitely not part of. And remember you're thinking about, has it been eaten as well? And just see what you can think about that. I'll give you a minute to look at that. Okay, you've had a minute to have a look at that. So what I'm going to do now is show you the animal it does actually come from. And again, it is the sheep. The same animal we were looking at in the last slide. So I wonder if now you can think about which part of that animal that bone came from. Okay, so you had a chance to have a think about that. It's actually a femur again. It's that same bone we were looking at before, but it's been sawn at both ends. So that bone has been sawn into a series of quite small, just a couple of centimetres thick slices. And in fact, this is precisely what you get if you buy a lamb steak with a bone in it. That's what you get. You can see, you can buy these in the supermarket now. It's quite expensive lamb, but and you can see there's the bone in the middle, and you can see in that meat there that that bone is exactly what you'd get, what's come from that archaeological site. So we actually know how the meat was being eaten from these little bits of bone. We also know that it's likely to be from about 1700 or more recently, the last 300 years, because we really don't find bone sawn before that. So that helps us date it. Okay, next example, a rather different sort of bone here. So have a think if you can work out what animal that was, whereabouts on it it came from, and again, do you think it was eaten? So that is from sheep again. So we've got three rather different bones, all from sheep. You probably got right that it's a jawbone. You can see the teeth in there. And of course, this isn't a meat-bearing bit of the body. Unlike the femur and the tibia, the leg bones, which do have a lot of meat on them, the skull doesn't have very much in the way of meat. So that often suggests you've got somewhere that instead of buying their meat in, like the previous example with those little sort of lamb leg steaks, That look like bought-in meat. These look very much like they're from a farm where the sheep are actually being bred. Now, it may be an old animal that died after it had spent a lifetime giving wool, but actually the example on the left is from a young animal, in fact. So we've got both an older animal and a younger animal, which again suggests that there may be a farm where they've got lots of animals. Some of them are being kept for wool and for breeding, and others are being slaughtered for meat younger. So here's the next example. I wonder if you can work out what this one is. And again, have a look at the size. Okay, I wonder if you managed to work out what that is. I'll just show you the picture of the animal it comes from. So this is from a cow. Okay, so can you now work out where you think on the animal that bone came from? Now, I suspect you might have got that right, but then it's very easy to think it's easy when you know what it is. It's actually, of course, the cow's horn. So, see from on its head. Horn's an incredibly useful material, actually, because the outer edge of the horn is like your fingernails. And in the pre-modern era, it's effectively the equivalent of plastic. If you heat it up in water, if you boil it up, it becomes very pliable. So you can use it for all sorts of things like making drinking cups and so on. So it's a very valuable material. You often find this as a horn core. The outer layer has been stripped off it and the horn has just been thrown away there. Again, it suggests there's been manufacturing going on. Somebody's been, again, it might be a farm, it might be someone who specialises in using these horn core to make other products. And they made quite nice cups because they were translucent in an era when you didn't really have translucent materials very much. Cups were either made of metal or they were made of pottery. Okay, this is the next example. Have a look at this and see what you think this is. Again, have a look at the size and have a look at whether you think it was eaten or not. Okay, so you've had a chance to have a look at that. Whether you managed to identify what animal it was, I think you must have probably thought it's a fairly big animal. I mean, that bone is more than 20 centimetres long and is not even complete at one end anyway. So this is the animal this was from. Again, it's a cow. So have a look at that and then see where on the body you think that bone came from. So looking at that, it's a femur. Again, it's a long bone. You've seen quite a few long bones now, leg bones. So I hope you're starting to get just a little bit better at recognising those. And you can definitely tell it's not something like a vertebra bone along the backbone. It's not a bone from the skull. It's not from the shoulder blades. It's not from the hooves. You can tell sort of where it might come from. And then you can look at the size. And that immediately starts you to think, well, it's probably something big like a cow or horse or perhaps a large red deer. It's a big animal. So here's the next one. Again, have a look at this and see if you can work out what animal this is and where it came from. Okay, so you've had a chance to think about that. I'll now show you which animal it came from. And again, it's a cow. But it's a different bone from a different bit of the body. Can you work out where that's from? So I'll show you now where it's from. Of course, they're ribs. They're 3 ribs. Again, if you have your ribs, if you've ever eaten, spare ribs as a Chinese meal, you'll be familiar with ribs. But we don't really think about it, do we? We just, if we're eating meat, we just eat it and don't really think about the bones. And this is a sort again, this is a sort of a rib of beef. Is again, it's a big meat-bearing part of the body, so that is definitely those have definitely been eaten. And we can actually see in the close-up there, you can see the sawn ends again. So these have been sort of professionally butchered within the last 300 years or so, probably, and being sold at market. But the fact we found 3 of them together suggests perhaps that this is the farm where they're being prepared, perhaps, or maybe someone who just like an awful had one, occasionally had a big rib of beef with several ribs on it. So a quite exotic meal, an expensive meal for sure. So here's the next one. Have a look at this and see what you think this might be. So you've had a chance to look at that. Looks a bit strange, I suspect. So I'll show you the animal this is from. So that should help you a little bit. Can you work out what bone that is, or what part of the body that comes from? Okay, you've had a few minutes to do that. So it's a pig, of course, and it's actually the tusk, one of the front teeth from the pig. A tooth is just a bone, really. It's all part of the skeleton. So this is a male pig, are the ones that have the much bigger tusks. Here's another bone. Have a look at the size of that. You can see it's a very different size, and that will help you start to think about what animal that might be from. So you've had a couple of minutes to think about that, and perhaps which part of the body it comes from, or at least which part of the body it doesn't come from. So this is the animal that bone is from, and perhaps you can now look at that and actually work out which bone that actually is. Can you match it to anything you can see on the skeleton bone? So this is actually a rabbit, of course, and it's the scapula, the shoulder blade. And again, this is effectively a meat-bearing bit of the animal. Rabbits were bred for meat. They're also bred for fur, and again, of course, get more rabbits. But they are very much an elite thing before a couple of hundred years ago. They are very rare on sites that aren't sort of manorial sites or castle sites until you get into the Victorian period, and then we see them being used much more widely for sort of fur as well, and for meat. So here's the next example. Have a look at those and think what they might be. Okay, you've had a chance to have a look at those. If you got this right, had a look at the size, thought about how big those bones are. These may well be familiar to you. So from a chicken, chicken bones are, we often see chicken bones. You've had a roast chicken or something like that. You will have seen, or even a chicken drumstick, you'll have seen some of these bones. So whereabouts on the body do you think that came from? Okay, you might well have got this right. These are chicken femurs again, so they are the chicken drumstick, effectively. Well, if you have one, have a look at it, see how it compares. And here is some more bones. These are all from the same animal, well, the same breed of animal anyway. We're not sure if they're identical animal. The two examples at the top are the same bone from different angles, and obviously there's 6 of the little bones at the bottom. So again, have a look at them, think about the size, think about what animal you think those might be from. Okay, you've had a chance to think about where those are from. So that again is a chicken, but a different bit of the body. So have a think now about which bit of the body you think those bones came from. And the answer to that is it's the vertebrae and the skull. So the skull at the top, a characteristic shape really, but then it's easy if you know. And the vertebrae, again, very characteristic shape, very different to those long bones. You know, you can immediately see from that it's definitely nothing like the drumstick, the femur that we were looking at, or the tibia and the fibula, the longer, thinner bones. So what can all this hard work, and it is quite hard work, animal bone is quite difficult to identify. What can it tell us? So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of case studies. You might want to leave these to do at half term. There's no dig school over half term. Or you might want to carry on and do those now. So the first case study then is really around what was the impact of a lord being resident on life in a castle. And this is taken from some excavations I was running a few years ago on a very large castle site. It occupied, the aerial photograph you can see here, it occupied pretty much all of the areas covered with trees and the areas in between the bits covered with trees. And you can see, you know, in that village, it's a sizable chunk of it. It had an enormous high castle motte, but actually by the time of the period we're looking at, that would have been a little bit antiquated, but there'd been a huge range of buildings all around where all those trees are in that aerial photograph. And we did some excavations there. I found a huge amount of animal bone. Also, this is just a tiny amount that I put in the photograph here. But there were some interesting patterns in it from one of the trenches. So there's a table of data here, and it lists the number of bones from two different times, from the 13th century, between about 1200 and 1300 AD, and then from the 14th century, between about sort of 1300 and 1400 AD. And for each of the animal species listed down the side of that table, the figure gives you the number of bones from that animal. So take a bit of time to have a good look at that table and compare the data for the 13th century to the 14th century and write down the differences that you can see in these species, in the numbers of bones of each species, because this will tell you something about what people were eating at the two different centuries. And because we've got them from two different time periods, we can see change over time from that. Was there more or less meat being consumed? Was it the same species or different ones? Which was the healthier period even? So take as much time as you want to have a look through that, to talk over those questions, and to see if there's anything else that you can, any other observations you can make about what might have been going on at those periods from looking at that information. Remember some of the things we've talked about what cows and sheep and pigs are used for, about the role of dogs, or dog fox, dogs in particular, but deer and rabbit as being a bit special. Domestic goose, again, quite a special animal. Chickens, much more everyday, really. And then there's a strange sort of list of wading birds and corvids, crows, jays, sort of scavenging birds, unidentified birds. And then something rather different, cod, fish. Finding fish bone on archaeological site, they're quite small, so you need to be working quite carefully. And then rodent, probably a rat. So have a look at the differences and have a think about those questions and write your answers down in your workbook. Okay, so you've had a bit of time to write those answers down. So there's a source of information here. In the 13th century, that first period we were looking at, the data in the yellow bit of the table, The lords who owned Clare Castle didn't actually live there, very rarely visited, if at all. They had lots of other properties, including other castles, and most of their sort of activity and their time and energy was spent on the sort of Welsh border area. But then one battle changed all that. So read through the source, and then combining what it says in that source, which is a local history from about 100 years ago, but that's based on historical documents. Compare what that written source is telling us with what your knowledge of the bones and what that was telling you about what things were like in those 2 centuries and how they changed. And then write down your answers to the questions of, well, what can your knowledge of the bones enable you to add to this account by Gladys Thornton, who wrote this history? What can you add to her description of life at Clare Castle when Elizabeth de Burgh was there that you couldn't get from anywhere else, that you can get from the bones? And what's changed? In what way did her living there, she's one of the wealthiest women in the country, she's entertaining royalty, what difference did it make having her living there? So take as long as you want to think about that and write your ideas down. So I hope you enjoyed thinking about those ideas. And I think my answer to that would be the knowledge of the bones can actually add the reality of what actually happened. We have those household accounts, but we don't know what actually happened. Sometimes things that get written down, items that were purchased or plans that were drawn up or menus that were made, they tell us what people were intending. They don't necessarily tell us what actually happened, and they also don't often include detail of things like menus. What those bones give us is the information about what people were actually eating. So we can see a huge increase in the amount of beef that's being eaten, a reduction in the amount of chicken. It's a much richer red meat diet once Elizabeth of Clare is living there. We've also got, of course, the deer and the rabbit, those elite meats. The deer would have come from a park, the rabbits would have been farmed in a rabbit warren, a man-made rabbit warren. We've got those appearing in the 14th century. They're not there in the 13th century. Lords were still eating those meats at that time, but because they're not resident at that time, it's a bailiff or some sort of member of the servant attached to the family would have been looking after the castle. It would have been kept in good repair. There was even some building work done, but we don't see that wealth of food there. There's a real change once there's a very wealthy lady of the manor living there. We also see the move away from cod as well. Perhaps that was just a matter of taste. But we do see less fish being eaten in that 14th century period. And we can also see there's those rodent bones from the 13th century, but not the 14th century. Maybe with more people around, they were able to keep vermin away. Maybe there were more servants actually there, making sure the place didn't get a bit overrun and tatty if it was sort of not being lived in a lot of the time. So we can get quite a feeling for the opulence, the extravagance of the life that is happening there once Elizabeth is living there. And that's one of the great values of the archaeological evidence, is it shows us change over time. Elizabeth's household accounts are incredibly detailed, but they don't tell us what was happening 50 years before or 100 years before. They only span a relatively short period of time. So the archaeology helps us see change over time. So we'll now look at the next case study. It's a bit different, still based on animals. So this is Henry VIII's horse problem. And this comes from a set of data that a colleague of mine published with some other archaeologists a few years ago. a huge corpus of more than 8,000 animal bones from more than 100 sites across London, dating from 1220 to 1900, so a huge period of time. And they went through all of these. They're all from datable contexts, so they knew what date they were, and they measured them, and then they broke them down into species and compared them. The initial study was looking at sort of domesticated animals to see whether intensive breeding had changed the size of the domestic animals like sort of cattle and pigs. But then they started to look at the horse bones, of which there were more than a couple of hundred. They looked at the ones which were adult, so those epiphyses, those bits on the end of the bones which come detached. You remember we looked at with that sheep femur earlier. So they looked at the bones of the adults and they measured them. And looking at how the measurements changed over time showed some interesting developments. So have a look at the table there and the data that gives you the date and the height of the horses in hands at the withers and sort of shoulder. And so the bigger the number, the bigger the horse, basically. So have a look at that and see if you can see whether the horses are getting bigger over time or smaller over time, or whether something else is going on. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. So having had a look at that, I think you've probably noticed that actually there isn't a steady growth or even a steady decrease. Sometimes animals get bigger, they're bred to be larger if you want a more powerful horse. Sometimes they're bred to be smaller. Pigs generally have got smaller because they're big animals, pigs, and they're very powerful, but smaller ones are more easy to manage. But you can see in this horse height data, and again, we wouldn't have this from anywhere apart from the archaeology, we've actually got 1350, it's about 1362. By 1500, it's dropped quite considerably to 1268, then goes up again by 1600, and then sort of levels off, staying more or less where it is by 1650. So there's a big drop and then a big growth. So this is the first source to look at to try and think about that, and that's really looking at that drop, that period of the drop after 1350. So have a read through these sources and see what you think that's telling you about what happened to the horse size after 1350 and which three factors were significant in affecting that size. So have a look at that, look at those sources and write your answers down. So you've had a chance to write your answers down. I think you've noted probably that the horse size dropped. Remember, this is across 200 different bone measurements. And the key factors really, it seems, the top paragraph talks about aristocratic incomes declining, so that the wealthy people who owned horses and had the incentive to try and breed them actually lost interest in that. They didn't have the money for it. They were just breeding their horses with whatever horses happened to be around, even if those were smaller. There's then a question of outbreak of disease. There's a record that there's a murrain, an animal disease, which breaks out regularly and indiscriminately, killing lots of animals. So there may have been a smaller number of horses to breed from anyway. And then there's also the bad harvests, which would reduce the amount of fodder, the amount of food that there was for horses. And if an animal, indeed a human, if an animal is badly nourished, it won't reach its full size. So that could explain why the bone sizes are smaller. So we then go back to Henry VIII. Remember, we were starting off this case study about Henry VIII's embarrassment over horses. We know Henry VIII was embarrassed by the puny English horses. Have a look at these sources and see what they tell you about that. So the first one talks about Henry being embarrassed by the horses. The second one talks about the laws that he brought in to try and do something about it. So I'll give you a minute to read those and again to write down your answers to anything you think is interesting about that in terms of what does it tell you about what Henry VIII was concerned about, and what did he try and do. So you've had a chance to have a look at that, and you can see that he definitely talks about being embarrassed about it. The breed of good and strong horses of this realm is now lately diminished, altered, and decayed, and further is likely to decay if speedy remedy be not the sooner provided on that behalf. And the laws he brought in were quite dramatic. He wanted to control the size of breeding age mares amongst the aristocracy. He wanted to increase the number of stallions over 14 hands, the bigger animals held by the nobles. And he actually wanted to destroy horses that were too small. So he was really trying to selectively breed to get bigger horses. Have a look at the next two sources. The first tells us that Henry was optimistic this would work, and others disagreed. So having had a look at those, what do you think? What can the bones tell us about the effectiveness of Henry VIII's strategy for increasing horse size? Did he succeed? Was he right when he said, there has begun a good number of breed of horses which by the continuance is likely to short time much to increase? They're starting to get bigger, in a short time they'll get even bigger. What was this just bluster? The Venetian ambassador is saying, even 10 years after that, he's saying the island produces a greater number of horses than any other region in Europe. The horses are weak and of bad wind. They cannot stand much work, he dismissively says. So looking back at those bone measurement data, what do they tell us? Was the Venetian ambassador right, or was Henry? So what did you write down? It does seem, when we look at the change in those sizes of the bones, that Henry was actually right about his fairly dramatic laws about the size of horses that the nobles were to have, and about breeding them, and about destroying the smaller animals, had affected quite a change, because there's that sharp growth in the size of animals measured from their bones. And again, it's that change over time that we wouldn't have evidence for any other way, because we've got two sources that are disagreeing with each other. The bone evidence is giving us a third source of evidence, and we can compare it with earlier so we can see the difference. Again, is one of the strengths of archaeology, is that change over time. So I hope you've enjoyed that dig school. I hope it's told you something about how humans used animals in the past, and has enabled you to find out for yourselves how archaeologists can study animals and to learn a little bit about what different bones look like and how you could go about trying to answer questions about the past from looking at animal bones. What can this tell us? Well, of course, it tells us about the hugely varied ways in which humans and animals have been involved in living together, in helping each other, or sometimes even when we think about that rat and the Black Death, hindering. And it also tells us about change over time. It's that fact that we have bones from different dates that we can compare, and collections of bones that can tell us about what people were doing at different times. And this all matters, of course, because it helps us appreciate the value of animals to us, and also the role that animals play in society today, in our lives today, which is very easy to overlook. And to appreciate that the change over time is something that we have good evidence for from the archaeological record. So I hope you enjoyed that session of Dig School, and I hope to see you at another Dig School again sometime soon.